Welcome to this week's message from Burwood United Methodist Church. If you've watched many of these, you know that I'm Tim Wood, the supply pastor, and Burwood is a congregation located in Thompson Station, Tennessee. It's 200 years old. Today was a special day for Burwood because we had our first in-person service in a long time. Now, some of the little disadvantages of recording outside are that we get those noises, but they kind of break things up. I think it beats recording in front of a black backdrop, but we'll see. So, we're in difficult times, and what do we look for resources to help us get through this? Our scripture reading today is Isaiah 36:5. Lord, your love, Lord, reaches to the heavens, your faithfulness to the skies. Key word there is faithfulness. God's faithfulness to us. Now, 2020 has been an incredible year. I mean, they're going to be writing about this for the ages. At least I hope we don't have any more as crazy as this for a while. Of course, we have the pandemic. Almost 200,000 people have died from the pandemic. We have that. And then we have the fact there have been 7 million reported cases of COVID-19. 30 million people have lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic. We're in a presidential election year. The country's divided, and we just don't know where this is all going to go. But as we look through this, of course, we have our own personal resources, the things we rely on, but the best resource of all is God's faithfulness. Our faith may falter, but God's faithfulness does not. God is worthy of our absolute trust. After all, if we can't count on God, how can we count on God for salvation, for protection and provision? Now, one way you can build faith through remembering God's faithfulness is to think of past experiences in which you've seen God show His faithfulness to you. The inspiration for this sermon came from a devotional that's part of the Upper Room Devotional daily series, which I read online. The topic was not God's faithfulness, but the writer mentioned it near the end that she looked back and thought of examples of God's faithfulness. So that gave me the idea. I wanted to say something about dealing with the times we're in, so that's why I went with God's faithfulness. Now, I decided I would look back and see if I could remember examples of God's faithfulness to me. And for some reason, my mind darted back about almost 40 years when I was starting out as a newspaper reporter at the beginning of an 18-year career in journalism, followed by 18 years as a teacher. Now, reporters work on deadlines. You have to have the story done by a certain time in order for the newspaper to run on time, or even for your story to get in the paper, because if it's late, they might not put it in if it delays the press time. And if that's delayed, then the carriers get messed up and it's all a bad thing. So I can't tell you how many times I was facing a deadline. Now, I didn't have everything that I needed for the story. I really needed to get a hold of someone or get some bit of information. And a bunch of those times I just prayed. And you know what? Many of those times my prayer was answered, either by God doing something, or maybe it could have been by chance, but it seemed to be uncanny how many times what I prayed for happened. Now, I can't remember any times that it didn't work, but I don't remember everything. But I have this overwhelming memory of praying those prayers and getting them answered. Now, I've also been through a few challenging and unusual situations in life in which I saw God's faithfulness. As I mentioned, I was a journalist, and it was 18 years I was a newspaper editor. That is, I ran the news department of the daily newspaper, 2 different ones. And you can't believe some of the situations that can put you in, with all the people coming from the public, blaming you for everything, saying your coverage caused this. I mean, it was crazy. So, and then when you're a high school teacher for 18 years, you know you're going to get in some crazy situations. So when I found myself in these situations, if I had presence of mind, I would immediately say a prayer to God to help me out. Now, sometimes God sent me some bit of wisdom or something happened that helped me have a good outcome of those situations, but not always. But God did give me peace about it all and help me get through it. Now, another way God responds, God's faithfulness is in my life is when I do meditative prayer. Meditative prayer is when I go find a place by myself that's quiet. I kind of sit and close my eyes and try to clear my mind of all those thoughts about all the things I'm going to do, all the busy things I have going. And I kind of try, I used to call it be still and know time. Be still and know, K-N-O-W, that I am God. I find that many times I'm trying not to really say a lot to God. I'm just trying to listen. But a problem may pop up in my mind that's been bothering me. And almost immediately after that happens, a thought comes in my mind that shows a wholly different way to approach it that might just work. Now, I could say that God inserts those thoughts into my mind, or I could say that the act of meditative prayer opens up my mind. Opening up to God broadens my thinking, and that's how I think of those things. So those are some of the ways. Now, and you could be thinking of some of those ways, some of those things in the past that have happened. Maybe you've forgotten about them, or maybe upon looking back, you'll even more see the significance of God's faithfulness in them. So, but now, look, let me give you an example of someone who looked back at God's faithfulness for support. As Paul approached the end of his life, he wanted to give his life to God, to sacrifice his life. And the reason he felt confident in doing that was because he was confident in God's faithfulness to save his soul. So if he died, he knew he would be with God. He had that confidence based on God's faithfulness in the past. And Paul could look back at situations in which God's faithfulness was true for him. One example, Paul was hauled in front of the Roman Emperor Nero. Now, Nero persecuted Christians. He killed Christians, often in horrible ways. Paul went before Nero, but God did too. Because Paul looked back and said, now, none of the other Christians came to support Paul. It was just Paul and God too. As Paul stood there, he spoke. He even preached the gospel in that hostile situation. God was with him and helped him get through that situation. And that's one of the ways that Paul saw God's faithfulness in his life. Now, sometimes people don't show a lot of trust in God's faithfulness. Take the nation of Israel. When they were wandering through the desert, they came to this place where they camped, but there was no water. So they got all grumbly and mad. Now, these people had already complained. Some of them thought this traipsing through the wilderness was worse than being back in Egypt and being a slave. And they wanted to go back, but they didn't, and it turned out better for them. So, but they complained and grumbled. They even questioned God's faithfulness. Is he not one of us, they asked. Well, in the end, God provided the water. He was faithful to them despite their attempt to irritate him. Now, you may wonder about, okay, you pray on the basis of God's faithfulness, but the response you get doesn't come as soon as you'd like, or it isn't the response you would like. How do you deal with something like this? Well, people like to say that, oh, God didn't hear my prayer, God didn't listen to my prayer. God listens to every prayer. Now, a lot of people want to say, you didn't listen to me if you don't agree with them. I can't tell you how many students told me that when I was a teacher. Said, you're not listening to me. Well, they've said the same thing 5 times in a row, and I disagree with what they said. I disagreed with it 5 times in a row. But that's the way some people are, and maybe I've been that way a time or two. But God does listen. Now, one way a prayer can be answered is if you pray within the will of God, which you learn through study, through experience. And your prayer should be consistent with God's glory and be for the good of God's people. Now, let's say maybe your faith is lacking. Maybe you're not too high on these past examples of God's faithfulness. Well, pray anyway, because the act of praying at least shows something. And in the book of Mark, we're told of how Jesus was asked if he could drive the evil spirit out of a young man. His father said, if you could do anything, and Jesus said something like, what do you mean could? Well, then the man said, he was shocked. He said it was going to happen. He said, I do believe. Help me overcome my disbelief. It's part of the faith journey. Now, God looks at the long term in answering prayers. Not getting an immediate yes doesn't mean that God didn't listen. I tell you what, there are a lot of prayers I have prayed that I'm glad that God didn't answer the way I wanted him to. We tend to dictate to God the way we want our problem solved, and sometimes there are obvious solutions that are right, but sometimes they aren't. Some people try to use prayer to tell God what to do. I remember, at least myself, sometimes I'd end a prayer with, if it be thy will. All right, I'm not criticizing that necessarily, but I want to do my study and my groundwork to make sure that what I pray for is in God's will, as best as I can. If I'm not sure, I just tell God that. Now, we might not recognize God's answer right away. It may take a while. The answer may happen, but we may not recognize it. I've looked back in my life and seen things that I had a better understanding of because of the length of time that has passed and me learning more about life. An example in the Bible of a person being in a difficult time is Joseph. Joseph in the multicolored coat. His brothers got jealous of him, so they sold him to slaves who took him back to the capital of the nation. He got thrown into prison. Now, you might say, all right, where was God showing faithfulness to Joseph? But God extended kindness to Joseph in prison. He did become the commander of the prisoners, and he went on to be one of the rulers of the country, making some very important decisions as the country went through some tough times. Now, if you think God has not answered your prayer, you might be missing something. If God has not answered in a way that is known to you, it doesn't mean God is not listening. So what I invite you to do is, again, take a look at your past. Think of God's faithfulness to you, the faithfulness to his promises. Think of what God has promised to us. Think how God is faithful. God is consistent. He is firm. You can count on God. And going forward, build off of those past experiences of God's faithfulness to help you deal with the world going forward. Amen.